how do you go from Pennsylvania writing degree in economics into the film industry? Like, how does that jump happen?
Sure. It was a degree in English and economics, so it wasn't writing, but I've always been interested in story, and I really wanted to go into the music industry. I really view songs as just another storytelling medium, right? The way that you can be transformed in a song in 2 minutes or 4 minutes or however long that song is, I feel like is a real parallel with just whether it's playwriting and theater or filmmaking. It's just another opportunity to tell a story. So when I was in college, though, the music industry was being decimated. So I realized if I'm stealing music, I'm essentially stealing from my future self. So this is going to get probably much worse before it gets better. And then I had an opportunity to intern at Miramax. I was interning in publicity and then in acquisitions. And so when I graduated, I was just looking for an entry-level job, and a job opened in delivery and business affairs, which was really incredible because even though delivery is not glamorous by any stretch, it is really laid singularly the foundation for every movie I make, because people don't typically think about, like, okay, once I get my movie in the can, how do I actually get it out into the world? Yeah. And so at 21, suddenly having a really strong understanding of all of the elements, whether they're physical elements or paperwork that needs to be in place for a distributor to then take a movie and distribute it, was great. I was also scanning a lot of legal contracts, so I got to read a lot of people's deals and just get a little bit of a beginning of insight into deal structures, whether it was even finances or producers or directors or actors or music licenses, anything. It was a really great experience. I was there. I think it was In the Bedroom and City of God and that sort of era. It was a really, really great experience.
So was that kind of the catalyst to think about kind of different positions in film? I mean, how did producing jump about? Was it when you jumped to Green Street and you actually got to kind of hands-on in films, or was it different?
It took me a while to understand what producing really encapsulates. I was ultimately downsized at Green Street at Miramax. I remember there was this email sent around. It was like on a Monday or Tuesday that said, like, after Friday, there will be no more free soda. And across the whole floor I was on, you just heard chairs screeching, backing up against the floor as people got up to go to the pantry to, like, grab soda before it disappeared. I think I got like 2 6-packs of sun-kissed orange soda out of it. But in the downsizing, then I just had to go find another job and an opportunity. First, I worked very briefly for an entertainment attorney named Donna Bascom, who's a really great entertainment attorney. And then a job opened up at Green Street, and they were finishing delivering, I think they were finishing delivering In the Bedroom and Pinheiro to Miramax, so essentially to my old self. And and because I had that little bit of background already from Miramax, they had other movies that they were then delivering. I think it was Swim Fan was going to Fox. So I was able to come in and help support that. But because Green Street was a smaller production and financing company, they were 10 to 15 people or so, everybody was essentially doing everything. So every weekend we would all read scripts, and I quickly started to realize that the next step after if everyone all liked a script, the next step with that script in the process towards greenlight was to do a budget and a schedule. So I asked my boss if he could teach me, and he did. I mean, it took me probably the better part of 2 years to really start to wrap my head around the nuance of that process. But I'm sure for him it was exhausting as well, having me constantly asking questions. But probably what it also meant is that if I was doing those schedules and budgets, then it meant he didn't have to. But that just helped really open up my worldview of like, oh, okay, this is how much that would cost to do, or here's a way to shape a schedule. And I started to get just a much fuller picture of how stories get translated onto the screen. And it also became a very sort of intimate, I became a more intimate part of the conversation, because in understanding how to properly schedule a movie, I'm having conversations with the director suddenly of like, how, what's your priority? How do you want to do this or that? And so I was then poised for when I left Green Street. I left Green Street right after they made Prairie Home Companion, the Robert Altman movie. I left with a background suddenly in physical production, even though I certainly wasn't fluent in it by any means, but I understood the questions that needed to be asked and how to be thinking about it, and also with all the various jurisdictional incentives that started to appear, just navigating like the idiosyncrasies of those, but I always knew I've always been drawn to story. I mean, even with songs, just like the sort of emotional pull has always been something, or even intellectual pull has always been something that has been extremely appealing to me. So figuring out then, what are the stories that speak to me? What are the movies that move me? What are the movies that that really help me on a day-to-day? And then how can I find those types of stories, and would they speak to audiences, and then figuring out like, okay, well then how can I apply the skill set that I had to help get those stories made and help support the visions of people who want to tell those stories.
So that
was a very long answer.
No, but it got us, I think, to basically like the mid 2000s, basically.
Yeah.
How did the documentary with Jason come about?
Sure.
And that
was a real highlight.
Talk about that. I mean, that festival experience on that film alone, I think, opened many doors.
It was incredible. I met Jason the first day of college. I initially went to Brandeis University, where Jason went, and I transferred to University of Pennsylvania. But I literally met Jason the first day of college. He was also online at the bookstore buying books, and I think he was wearing a T-shirt of some band, and even though I didn't like that band, it was just there was a connection there. At least, like, I knew that we spoke the same language, and so he has always been extremely inquisitive and provoking in conversation. And so while I was at Miramax, I remember he was working for Errol Morris, and he called me and said, we can keep doing what we're doing. I can keep doing research in this basement on Errol's movie, or we can just go make our own movie. And I was like, sounds great. Hold, please. Allison Silver's office. And then, okay, Jason, let's go make the movie. So Jason's family, though, when they moved to America 100 years ago, from the pogrom,
our audience will get that.
Yes. Instead of essentially just, when us Jews were persecuted out of Europe, his family went to South America before coming up to North America. And so his dad, even though Jason grew up on Long Island, his parents had split up and his father had moved to Sao Paulo. And so Jason was spending summers there, wanted to learn Portuguese, and found this story of mass injustice that's happening in Brazil, and sort of became fascinated with the sort of cyclical nature of corruption and kidnapping, and how in a country like Brazil, where there is no real middle class anymore, you have the wealthy and powerful stealing from the poor, which, frequently in that case, is not just preventing people from eating, you're just flat out murdering them. And the poor, in turn, actually physically stealing the wealthy to try to get, ransom money. And that was a really interesting idea. And then we sort of locked onto the idea of the frog farm, which visually felt like something no one had ever seen before. I haven't seen it since. Yeah. And so Jason started going down to Brazil, raising money very slowly, asking friends for $100 or $250. And out of that money, we were able to shoot a teaser, essentially a 20-minute teaser, which then we won a number of grants, including the Soros grant, which is now the Sundance grant, which then gave other people confidence that we could achieve this overall vision. But I'm so glad we made that movie, because now, with all of my experience, I probably wouldn't have let that movie get made. I mean, we shot it on anamorphic Super 16, which is just bonkers to shoot a documentary on film. And there was a moment, so we had to shoot in 3 different production phases. And I remember after the second production phase, we had edited together a rough cut of the movie, but it was missing this critical interview with an actual kidnapper. And I remember sitting at our financier's office in Midtown Manhattan, it was a Sunday, and we had just all watched the movie, and just us all turning to Jason and being like, I know this is crazy, but we think you have to go back to Brazil to try to find a kidnapper. And him being like, I know, I have to go find it. And it's not easy to find murderers and kidnappers. They're not just like announcing themselves on the street corner. So Jason went down there. I was at this point at Green Street. And it was very difficult to find someone. At first, Jason had approached the prison system, and they were trying to make introductions to us, but then they thought that we were doing an expose on the corruption of the Brazilian prison system. Wow. So they shut us down, and then we couldn't find someone. And then finally, Jason, one day, I think he had a toothache or something, and his dad said, let me call a taxi for you. And there was this one taxi company that that his father frequently used, and the guy is driving Jason to the dentist. I haven't told this story in a long time, so I may not be remembering it exactly right, but the guy says, Jason, how's the movie going? And Jason says, it's not going so well. I need to find a kidnapper. And the guy says, well, look, there's a guy I know who I make deliveries for. He'll give me a package. I never ask what's in the package. I drop the package off. He gives me money. But maybe that guy knows other people. And so we were like, okay, that's a lead. And then Jason ends up on the phone with some other guy. And Jason's like, have you robbed people? Yes. Have you pulled off people's fingernails for ransom? Yes. Have you cut off people's ears for ransom? Yes. Have you killed people? Yes. We were like, great, can we interview you? And so then that led to this really quite infamous interview with the kidnapper, who is a real Robin Hood figure in the favelas there. And we were just very fortunate to interview him because he had 9 children. His wife was pregnant with a 10th. And he really felt like, who knows? I mean, maybe one of my kids will grow up and be the person who fixed this whole corrupt country. And then 2 or 3 weeks after we filmed him, he was shot in a rooftop shootout. It was just a totally wild experience making that movie, and something I'm really grateful for. And Jason is still one of my best friends. He has a movie that's coming out very soon called Love Means Zero about Nick Bollettieri, the tennis coach that Showtime made, and it was just at Toronto, and it's really well received. So And he and I are trying to find more things to do together. We have another documentary. But the experience then of getting into Sundance was, as incredible as people always say it is, but I was so naive that I thought that after that movie, we won the grand jury prize, and I've now had 6 or 7 movies at the festival. I thought that, once you win the grand jury prize, a magical door appears, and on the other side is like a big pile of money and the script for me to go produce Spider-Man 3 or something. That doesn't work that way.
It's not Utah. It sucks.
Yeah.
But you've kept that love of documentary throughout. But what made you make the next step? What was once you figured out there wasn't cash at the end of the Utah door?
Sure.
Tell me what was that next very step?
It was really just a fortuitous coincidence. While I was at Sundance, I was introduced to the guys that wanted to finance Jonathan Levine's movie, The Whackness.
Uh-huh.
They had never been to New York, and they had never made a union movie. And on paper, I looked like I knew what I was doing, right? I went to an Ivy League school, I worked at Green Street, I worked at Miramax, I worked at Green Street, and I just won the grand jury prize at Sundance. So I had never line produced anything, but I knew that I could probably figure it out.
Yeah.
And I certainly, was very comfortable with New York crews and the unions, and I had a lot of experience with that. And so then I met John Levine, and I just thought, I didn't know how to articulate this then, but I thought he was very clear on what he wanted The Whackness to be, and I loved the script, and John has this wonderful sort of buoyancy to him that is quite magnetic, and I was really just allured by the opportunity. At the same time, if I remember this correctly, at the same time I was interviewing to be like the VP of development at Scott Rudin's office.
Wow.
And I had been through, I think, 2 rounds of interviews, and I didn't know whether I was going to get that job or not ultimately. And then Ben Kingsley signed on to The Whackness, and we had a start date, and I figured, well, I'll probably make more money in 3 or 4 months on The Whackness than I would make in a whole year at Rudin's place if I made it a whole year at Rudin's. And I really just didn't know if I was going to get that job. So then I went and made The Whackness, which was great because that got into Sundance. So I had Montevala at Sundance in 2007, and The Whackness was at Sundance in 2008, which was just a great experience. And that sort of set me off on a producing track, but coming at it from a different approach, because suddenly, and really inadvertently, I had this physical production background and experience, even though I've always had a very sort of more creative, or what is, I guess, considered, physical production isn't considered a creative thing, but even though I actually think it is really quite creative, because it's just so much problem solving. But even though I always had more of just a traditionally creative leaning, suddenly I had this physical production background, and people were calling me to ask me to come and line produce their movies, which I felt like this is an incredible opportunity, because what it'll allow me to do is just become more fluent on deal making and various incentives, and get to work with people I may not have otherwise been able to work with at the point I was at in my career, if I was just trying to be a creative producer. So it's really been an invaluable background to have.
Do you mind if I just throw out some directors or films that you may have been on that journey with? Kind of first ones that I think of is Tom's The Visitor, Tom McCarthy.
Mm-hmm.
What was that experience like? That seems, because that was obviously very different than The Whackness tone-wise.
Yeah, The Visitor. The Visitor was really interesting because Tom is a really exacting director and incredibly demanding. And we were shooting, the hardest thing was really, we were shooting at the same time as American Gangster and I Am Legend. So there was no crew, there was no gear, and we didn't have any movie stars, so nobody cared about us. We weren't able to, I haven't thought about the Visitor in a long time. We weren't able to just get any help. I think we went through like 8 boom operators on that show in like a 25-day, because people just couldn't stick around. They'd get an offer to go work on American Gangster or I Am Legend and make $60 or $80 an hour, as opposed to the 20 we were able to offer. So it was extremely difficult. That movie still probably remains the most challenging movie I've made. I remember there was one day we were shooting on 2nd Avenue and 7th Street in Manhattan, and we couldn't even find a honey wagon. So we had this honey wagon, which is what holds the crew and the day playing cast. We had a honey wagon from 1976, and I'm standing on the corner and I see something coming out of the bottom of the honey wagon, and I was like, and then I see somebody walk out of the men's room in the honey wagon, and I was like, that's shit. Shit is literally falling onto 2nd Avenue. And I was like, okay, it's 2 a.m. That's an EPA violation. This is a new problem for me to have to figure out. And it was just rife with, that movie was rife with stuff like that.
It's a good word choice, rife, after that. Wow, I don't think I ever would have expected a shit story from The Visitor. That's amazing. We talked earlier this week with Marcus and Carrie Cox.
Sure.
Can I bring up the adult
beginners?
Yeah, I don't know why that blanked up.
Yeah.
What was that experience like? What did you get from that?
That was wonderful because the director, Ross Katz, has become a very dear friend, but Ross was a producer prior to directing and produced in the bedroom. Mm-hmm. So I was working with Ross. I was answering the phone when Ross would call, essentially. But so in the early part of my career, Ross loomed very large because he made In the Bedroom and then made Lost in Translation. So I was like, that sounds like a person to emulate. So I was very excited then, 10 plus years later, to be asked to produce a movie he wanted to direct. And we were connected through Mark Duplass because Mark and I made the Skeleton Twins together, and Mark was on The League with Nick Kroll, and Adult Beginners was Nick Kroll's idea. And they were looking for a producer, so Mark had recommended me. So I remember getting together with Ross the first time and being like, Ross, it's me, Jared. And he was like, what? How do we know each other? And I was like, does this sound familiar? Tim Williams' office. And he was like, oh, you were that guy. And I was like, yeah. And he was like, oh, that's right. Well, it's nice to see you again. And then at the end, and we had like a 2 or 3 hour lunch meeting. He was like, it's so great for us to be reconnecting now. And he's like, I'm sorry I didn't have a clearer memory of you from those early days, but I'm really quite pleased that we're connecting now. So the wonderful thing about this industry is like there's no ladder to climb, and there's always moments you never know when opportunities like that, suddenly you're someone's assistant, and the next thing you're producing a movie with them. Those opportunities arise all the time. I find that to be a wonderfully hopeful thing.
Yeah. I just want to throw out the name Craig Johnson.
Craig Johnson is a dear friend. Oh wait, to go back to Adult Beginners. So Adult Beginners was just a really fun experience. Nick Kroll and I now have another movie we're doing together. Ross Katz and I have another movie we're doing together. And it was sort of an all hands on deck movie, and I think it's had a nice life subsequently.
It did very well.
Yeah. With Craig, what was funny though was there's sort of a parallel between Skeleton Twins and Adult Beginners in the sibling, the estranged siblings. Adult Beginners, I think, is probably a little bit more accessible movie than Skeleton Twins, but throughout making Adult Beginners, I was like, okay, I guess there's a parallel here that I hadn't realized. But with Craig, Craig and I have now made 3 movies together. We just finished Alex Strangelove for Netflix, which will come out in the spring. It's been a real joy to work with Netflix. They've just been incredibly nurturing and very supportive. And now, I feel like having had Ingrid Goes West out this past summer, and we spent a lot of money, or Neon spent a lot of money on digital marketing. So I feel like I have a really up-to-date understanding of digital marketing. So I'm excited to be able to then utilize the resources of Netflix to apply the education that I just got in digital marketing for Alex Strangelove. But Craig is just someone, he and I just have a wonderful rapport and a lot of trust. But that's an example. I initially came on to Skeleton Twins as a line producer, and I had read that script and I thought it was just so funny and there was so much heart to it. But that's a relationship then that with Craig that developed into a proper producing relationship. And what I'm able to do now, when the scheduling allows, is I will not only produce the movie, but I'll also line produce the movie, which I think is probably really beneficial for the financier, because it becomes one-stop shopping essentially. If they have a creative question or a question related to the finances, they can call me. But there's also an efficiency to it in terms of my own producing power, because since I know how all the money's being spent, I know if Craig wants to do something, or if I make a suggestion, to what degree we can do that, because I have my finger on the pulse of how much everything's cost and how much, how we're trending over and under every day with the finances of the movie. So it's been, having the line producing background has been incredibly empowering for me as a creative producer as well.
Can we jump back to
Sure.
to Netflix in particular? New avenues of showcasing your film. This must be, like you said, a whole new avenue. It's got to be kind of uplifting. There's a whole new stream of things that you can showcase a film.
Yeah, well, I think it's still Netflix hasn't quite been able to ignite their audiences behind their feature films the way they have behind their comedy specials or documentaries or TV shows. So I'm eager to see how they're able to do that, with using Alex Strangelove to try to figure out how to do that. But it's incredible. And over the summer I taught at NYU at the Tisch undergrad producing class, and what was really helpful and rewarding with that experience was my students. Ingrid came out the last week of classes, and I taught for like 6 or 8 weeks or something. And over the course of the class, my students would come in and say, "Oh, we saw, advertising for Ingrid on YouTube or BuzzFeed or wherever. We can't wait to see the movie." And I'd say, "That's so great. It's going to be in theaters in 2 weeks." And they'd say, "Yeah, that's great, but when's it going to be on Netflix?" And I was like, right, okay. So even though I certainly love having movies in the theater maybe for my own vanity, but having that immediate confrontation with the students in understanding like they don't really care about going to the theater. In fact, a number of my students said that they not only is it too expensive, but relative to their bed and their couch, it's just inconvenient and uncomfortable, which I can't argue with that. So as much as I love the idea of people going to the cinema to see something on a big screen, being told by my students that like that's just not a priority and there's really no urgency to it, now that there's so much content available to them all the time, the urge to have a movie in the theater has like moved down my priority list.
I don't think Ingrid would want to go to the theater.
Right, Ingrid herself would not go to the theater.
Talk about I mean, from the whackness to Ingrid, I think there's a crazy hipness, or in films, you've always kind of had a good pulse of what's cool, I guess.
Well,
even in like
you.
Skeleton, with Bill and Kristen. What's it like being on the pulse of a younger generation?
It's really just my taste. I try to stay current with culture, whether it's music, and music really plays a very big part in my life. Music or movies, I just try to think like what feels interesting and original or edgy, and I read voraciously, so not only scripts but books, and so what are the stories that speak to me, and what are the conflicts? I mean, ultimately the type of material I'm drawn to, I appreciate you saying that it's cool, but it all just sort of harkens back to the old adage of, make them laugh, make them cry. All those movies have a playfulness and a little bit of a melancholy to it somewhere, and just navigating those, threading those two things. So that's really what it is I'm drawn to. I appreciate that that they feel slightly edgier. I hope to continue to do that, but I'm also just trying to stay very present and enjoy that for the moment people do want to see the movies that I'm trying to shepherd.
What's it like being able to not only teach at places like Tisch, but to come to a festival where you have a lot of people who want to get their story out? I mean, I think that's the beauty of Austin Film Festival. It's not just a lot of young writers, but it's writers from all different levels and age groups, and it's
Tisch,
diverse.
Sure, Tisch was challenging and rewarding, but extremely disorienting. Just because what I noticed with my class is that when I was growing up, I was learning about movies and music because I had to go and actually really seek this stuff out, and I was learning about other bands by reading. I was learning about other bands by reading the thank you notes in the the liner notes of an album, and then seeing what bands do they thank, and so with my students, I didn't notice that the same level of like inquisitiveness or hunger or yearning to find that stuff out, because they can just go on Spotify, or they can just go on Netflix or iTunes, and so there's certainly many of them were really quite astute and perceptive, and some of them had that sort of yearning, but it didn't feel as ubiquitous as it did when I was growing up. So that was sort of unexpected, but that's okay. With the film festival, I've never been to Austin before, even though I've had movies that have played here. So the last 24 hours have been just sort of orienting myself in town, which has been very fun. It's also just fun to go to a film festival now, because I feel like with the sort of contracting of the cinema-going experience, it's an opportunity to be around like-minded people who also like seeing things on a big screen. I mean, yesterday I got here, I met up with Jim Hart after his panel.
Heart chart.
Yeah, and he was with friends, and they immediately started talking about like, in the second act of love, how do you use a negative to get to the end rise of the second act? And I never, I'm never around that many writers at one time, so it was really quite fun and lively to be in a theoretical conversation about writing. I'll be happy when I leave those conversations, because they can be a little bit bit crazy making, yeah. But it's fun to just engage and immerse yourself in a conversation about story.
Yeah, it's funny. They did Lady Bird was the big screening last night, and I saw Jeff Nichols in the background sneak in, and I'm like, oh, I'm gonna talk to Jared tomorrow.
Yeah.
Anything you want to say about Loving?
He's incredible. I mean, Loving was an incredible movie, I think, and it's just an incredible story. Look, Jeff, I think, had the right approach to it. What I love about his take on the Loving story is there is a version of the movie that feels like this big Supreme Court, drama, but ultimately, I thought his take of people leaving the theater and feeling like, what was the big deal? Why were the police and authorities and like Richard and Mildred, they just loved each other. They weren't bothering anybody. And I feel like that is just such a wonderful takeaway to have. With Jeff, I just don't know why more people, more media outlets didn't talk about the fact that the guy also had Midnight Special out last year, and to have both Midnight Special and Loving out in 1 year is really, really impressive. So I'm so excited to see what Jeff does over the next 50 years or so.
Yeah, special director. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I guess to wrap things up, Jared, I'd love to know. Obviously Alex is coming out, but what other projects do you kind of have?
Sure. Craig and I have another movie called Nasty Little Suckers that we're hoping to shoot next year, which is essentially Gremlins.
Really?
Yeah. Then he and I also have a documentary we're doing that I'm producing with Fred Armisen on the B-52s. I've got a movie that I'm hoping to shoot next year that Joe Robert Cole wrote and will direct. Joe wrote The People vs. O.J. and wrote Black Panther. So I'm producing that with Color Force, which is Nina Jacobson and Brad Simpson, who produced The Hunger Games. And then there's a whole bunch of more stuff. There's a YA series called The Expeditioners that McSweeney's released that I'm really excited to try to bring to a screen, whether it's movies or TV screens. So it's good. I'm just, the fun thing with something like The Expeditioners is it takes me out of my comfort zone, because it'd be a really big thing that hopefully would one day end up as a theme park ride. So it's, what's fun for me is to go into meetings talking about it and be like, from the guy who made the Skeleton Twins and Ingrid Goes West and Loving comes this theme park ride. So it's always good to challenge yourself.
Another generation to conquer, if you will.
Yes.
Jared, it's been a real pleasure. Obviously, I'm a huge fan of all the work that you've done, and can't wait to see you and Craig do Gremlins.
Yeah, we'll see if we can get it going. We're trying.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jared.